It was a crisp autumn morning when Karoline Leavitt first laid eyes on the old, delicate necklace. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long, dappled shadows on the ground, as she walked briskly through the small, charming town of Willowbrook. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that only small towns possess, where everyone knows everyone's name, and the silence hums with history. But Karoline wasn't paying attention to the town's peacefulness. She was too preoccupied with the weight in her heart, the burden that had been there for as long as she could remember. The necklace was a reminder of something she'd long buried. But there it was, sitting in the dusty corner of the small antique shop, as if it had been waiting for her all these years. She didn't even know why she walked into the shop that morning. Perhaps it was the pull of nostalgia, or the whisper of fate. It certainly wasn't a place she'd usually visit, but the moment her fingers brushed against the necklace, she knew something had changed. It wasn't just any necklace. The small pendant, a silver heart, looked ordinary enough at first glance. But as Karoline picked it up, she saw the fine details that set it apart. An engraving, faded but legible, that read, "For my sweet girl, with love, always." Her breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the piece she had been searching for, the one that had haunted her dreams. It was the necklace her mother had given her before she passed away. A token of their unspoken bond. A piece of their shared past. The one that had been lost for so many years. The one Karoline had thought was gone forever. But how did it end up here? And why now? Her fingers tightened around the silver heart, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that finding this necklace wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. Something larger than herself was at play. And as she looked up at the old woman behind the counter, she realized she was about to step into a story far deeper than she could have ever imagined. One that would lead her to a young girl, and a journey neither of them would ever forget. Little did Karoline know, this necklace would bring her face to face with the most unexpected of connections. One that would unravel a truth that had been hidden for decades. And it would change everything. For both her and the little girl whose life was about to intertwine with hers in ways neither could have predicted. Karoline stood frozen, the silver necklace clutched in her palm, her heart racing. The soft chime of the antique shop bell broke her trance as a child's laughter echoed outside. She turned to the counter, where the elderly shopkeeper, Mrs. Everly, gave her a knowing smile. Her wrinkled hands, adorned with faded rings, gently reached for a worn leather-bound journal. "You found it," Mrs. Everly said, her voice thick with years of untold stories. Her eyes twinkled with a mix of sadness and warmth, as though she had known Karoline's heartache long before today. Karoline's throat tightened. This is my mother's necklace. How did it get here?" Mrs. Everly's smile faded into something more somber, almost sorrowful. She set the journal down on the counter, her fingers brushing the edges gently, as if they too understood the weight of the moment. "I've been waiting for you," she said softly. "Your mother, she was here not long ago, before she passed." The words hit Karoline like a blow. Her mother? Had she left it behind intentionally? It didn't make sense. Karoline's chest tightened, and her breath quickened. She hadn't seen her mother in years. Her passing had left an aching void, and now, here was this piece of her. This connection, a fragile thread to a woman who had been the center of her world before she was taken too soon. "I don't understand," Karoline whispered, her voice trembling. "Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't I know?" Mrs. Everly's weathered eyes softened with compassion. "Your mother had her reasons. She didn't want you to know, Karoline, but it's time now. There's a little girl who needs you." The words hung in the air, heavy and haunting. Karoline's eyes flicked nervously from the necklace to the journal that lay on the counter. She felt a stirring, a flicker of something, deep within her. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the world outside the shop seemed to snap back into focus. The sound of children laughing, the breeze rustling the leaves, it all felt so distant, almost surreal. Mrs. Everly, noticing Karoline's hesitation, pushed the journal toward her. "Take it," she urged gently. You'll understand soon enough. But remember, you have to act fast. Time's running out." With trembling hands, Karoline took the journal, her pulse quickening. She had no idea what lay ahead, but she knew that this was the moment that would change everything. She had to find the girl. She had to understand why this necklace had reappeared in her life after all these years. And more than anything, she had to know what her mother's secret was. A new chapter had begun, and Karoline had no choice but to turn the page. Karoline clutched the journal to her chest as she stepped out of the antique shop. The sunlight now felt harsher, almost unforgiving, as if the world was demanding answers she wasn't ready to give. The weight of Mrs. Everleigh's words echoed in her mind. A little girl who needs you. What did that even mean? And why was she so suddenly thrust into this mystery involving her late mother? Her footsteps were shaky as she made her way to the small cafe at the corner of the street. Her usual refuge, where the gentle hum of conversation and the scent of freshly brewed coffee offered comfort. But today, none of it felt normal. She felt like an outsider in her own life, disconnected from everything she knew. She sat at a corner table, the journal open in front of her. The pages were filled with her mother's elegant handwriting. Flashes of memories Karoline thought she had locked away forever. But there was something else there. Something far more cryptic. The entries spoke of a promise her mother had made to someone, a pact of sorts. And in the last paragraph, it mentioned a name, Lily. The word was underlined twice, and the entry ended abruptly with a strange line. "Find her, Karoline, before it's too late." A chill ran down Karoline's spine. Who was Lily? And why had her mother kept this secret from her? She'd spent her entire life thinking she was the sole person who mattered to her mother. To learn that there was someone else, someone named Lily, was like a betrayal, even though she knew deep down that her mother hadn't meant it that way. Frustrated, Karoline slammed the journal closed. "I don't understand," she muttered to herself. "What am I supposed to do with this? How can I even start looking for someone if I don't even know where to begin?" Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her spiraling thoughts. It was a text from her older brother, Ethan. "Karoline, have you seen the news? There's a girl missing in Willowbrook. Her name is Lily." Her breath caught in her throat. It was as though the universe was mocking her, throwing one clue after another just out of reach. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Could this be the same Lily? Was she the little girl Mrs. Everleigh had mentioned? The air in the cafe suddenly felt thick, suffocating. Karoline's fingers gripped the edge of the table as she tried to process what she was learning. The missing girl, the one whose name echoed in her mind, was just the beginning. The more she uncovered, the more tangled the threads seemed to become. Her thoughts were interrupted when the cafe door swung open, and in walked a familiar face. David, her ex-boyfriend. His sharp eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, she thought he might turn and walk away. But he didn't. Instead, he crossed the room with a determined stride and sat down across from her without waiting for an invitation. "I heard," he said quietly. "I heard about your mother's necklace. I know what it means." Karoline's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" David leaned in, his voice lowering. "There's more to your mother's story than you realize, and there's a reason she didn't want you to know. I've been trying to find answers for years. But you have to be careful now, Karoline. People will try to stop you from discovering the truth." Karoline's world tilted as his words sunk in. Her mother's past, her own history. It wasn't just tangled. It was dangerous. "You knew about this?" she whispered, her mind reeling. David's eyes darkened. "I didn't know everything, but I've learned enough. And if you're really going to search for Lily, you need to trust me. You're not alone in this, but the road ahead is full of shadows." His words stung with a warning, but they also planted a seed of doubt. Could she trust David? And if she did, what would it cost her? For the first time since finding the necklace, Karoline felt the weight of the truth pressing down on her. She wasn't just unearthing secrets about her mother. She was uncovering a darkness that had been buried for far too long. The night was suffocatingly still, as Karoline stood in front of the old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Willowbrook. The moon hung low, casting a dim glow over the rusted metal structure that had long since been forgotten by most of the town. But Karoline hadn't forgotten. The journal, now dog-eared and filled with hurried scribbles, had led her here, led her to Lily, to the truth. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tightened her grip on the flashlight in her hand. Behind her, David lingered in the shadows, his eyes scanning the surroundings, alert for any sign of danger. They had come this far together. But now, as the night pressed in around them, Karoline couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. "Are you sure this is the place?" Karoline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her skin was tingling with anxiety, her mind swirling with 1,000 questions. Why had Lily been hidden for so long? What had her mother been protecting her from? David nodded, his face pale, under the moonlight. "This is where they'll be holding her. The people who are after her. They've been tracking her for years. She's the key to something they want. I don't know exactly what, but it's not good, Karoline." She nodded, swallowing the knot of fear that had formed in her throat. She had already lost so much, but she wasn't going to lose her sister. Not now. Not after everything she'd uncovered. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass and gravel. The closer they got, to the warehouse, the heavier the air felt, thick with danger. They reached the door. Karoline could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. She paused, hand resting on the rusted handle, her heart pounding in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run. But she knew there was no turning back. Not now. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The creak of the hinges echoed in the vast emptiness, sending a shiver down her spine. Inside, the darkness was suffocating, broken only by the faint flicker of distant lights. Then, she heard it. A small, strangled cry. "Lily!" Karoline's voice broke through the silence, and in that moment, she realized how long she had been searching. For this connection, for this girl who shared her blood, her history. She had to save her. They moved swiftly, each step a heartbeat, until they found her, small, scared, and shackled to a chair in the center of the room. The sight of Lily nearly brought Karoline to her knees. The girl was barely 9 years old, with wide, terrified eyes that mirrored the same fear Karoline had felt so many times growing up. Lily's eyes locked on hers, and in that instant, the two shared an unspoken understanding. They were sisters, bound by blood, bound by fate. "Don't be afraid," Karoline whispered, kneeling in front of her. She reached for the cuffs around Lily's wrists, her fingers trembling as she worked to free her. Suddenly, the sharp sound of a door slamming shut behind them shattered the moment. Karoline spun around, her heart lurching. A figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and imposing, with cold, calculating eyes. "Karoline," he said, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "You're too late." It was him. The man who had been hunting Lily. The one who had been part of the organization her mother had tried to escape. The one who had been watching Karoline's every move. He stepped forward, his hand reaching for the gun at his side. "You're not going to leave here alive." Time seemed to slow as Karoline's mind raced. She couldn't let him hurt Lily. She couldn't let him take her away again. Without thinking, Karoline lunged, knocking the gun from his hand. The two struggled, the world around them a blur of motion. But in that moment, something inside Karoline shifted. Something fierce, something unbreakable. David moved swiftly, grabbing a nearby piece of metal and using it to disarm the man, knocking him out cold. Karoline breathed heavily, her hands shaking as she turned back to Lily. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice breaking with relief. "I promise, you're safe." Lily clung to her, the tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know if anyone would come." Karoline pulled her into a tight embrace, her heart swelling with a love she had never known she could feel for this girl. This sister. The world outside still held its dangers, but for now, in this moment, they had won, but the fight wasn't over. Karoline knew that. The truth about her mother, The organization, the danger that still lurked in the shadows, none of it had been resolved. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she had found her sister. And with Lily by her side, Karoline knew they could face whatever was coming next. Together. The days following the confrontation at the warehouse felt like a blur. Karoline had never imagined that her life would take such a dramatic turn, that she would uncover so many secrets about her mother, her family, and her own identity in such a short span of time. But now, sitting at the kitchen table in the small house she had grown up in, with Lily sitting across from her, everything felt quieter. It wasn't the stillness of peace, but the kind of silence that comes after a storm has passed. The sun filtered through the windows, casting warm beams of light on the worn wooden table. Karoline watched as Lily played with the silver necklace, now hanging around her neck, the pendant catching the sunlight. It was a symbol of their connection, something that had been lost, found, and passed between them. David had stayed by their side, offering help with the aftermath of the warehouse ordeal, making sure they were safe, helping them disappear from the grasp of those who still hunted them. But now, as the dust began to settle, Karoline realized the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. Lily's presence in her life was a reminder of the deep, unspoken ties that connected them. Ties that had been hidden by their mother, but never truly broken. Karoline's mind raced as she thought of the future, the questions that remained unanswered, and the fight that still lay ahead. But in that moment, all of that seemed distant, even insignificant. Because for the first time in her life, Karoline didn't feel like she was alone. She wasn't just carrying her mother's legacy anymore. She was carrying Lily's too. And in a way, that made everything feel lighter, as if the burden of the past was finally being shared. "Do you think we'll ever know why they came after us?" Lily asked quietly, breaking Karoline's reverie. Her voice, small but steady, held a weight that was far too mature for her age. Karoline looked at her sister, the question hanging in the air. She had asked herself the same thing 1,000 times. Why had her mother kept so much hidden? What had Lily meant to those people? What had they been after? "I don't know," Karoline said softly, her fingers brushing against Lily's hand. "But whatever it was, we don't have to carry that weight alone anymore." Lily smiled up at her, her eyes still wide with a mix of uncertainty and trust. Karoline's heart ached for the little girl who had already been through so much, who had carried burdens that should never have been hers to bear. But together, they would find their way. Together, they would rewrite the story their mother had left behind, and they would make it their own. As the day wore on, Karoline found herself reflecting on the journey, the twists, the turns, the pain and loss, and the hard-won victories. She had come to understand one of the most profound truths of all. Family wasn't just defined by blood, but by the bonds forged through love, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand together in the face of danger. The world outside still held its darkness, but Karoline had found the light. And that light was more than enough to guide her and Lily through whatever came next. "I'll always protect you, Lily," Karoline whispered, her voice filled with an unwavering promise. Lily looked up at her sister, her smile shy but genuine. "I know." And for the first time, Karoline believed it. They would be okay. The weight of the past had been lifted, and ahead of them, an uncertain but hopeful future waited. Whatever battles lay in store, they would face them together. And as the sun dipped, low, casting a soft glow over the horizon, Karoline knew one thing for certain. Family, in its purest form, is always worth fighting for.